Hey, hi, hello, how are you? I'm Pia, and today we're talking about my top 10 books that I read in 2021. I do this video every year and it gets harder and harder every year because I read more and more books and it's so hard to narrow down this list. We have some all-time favorites in here, some books I think you really need to read if you haven't, and I'm just so excited to gush about my favorite books of the year. Let's do it. The order is a little bit like, could be subject to change, so we're not gonna like count down, but my top book, I don't know, my top few I think are in the right order, but like I don't know about some of them. Anyway, first we have The Mistletoe Motive. This is a novella that I read in December. It is a Christmassy romance. It's enemies to lovers. It's set in a bookshop. It has a demisexual and autistic main character and another main character who has diabetes. This is such a fantastic book. Just hearing the synopsis, you might say, well, Pia, that's literally your book. Yeah, I mean, obviously I love Christmas and I love bookstores and things like that, so I really loved it. It was so sweet, so cute. I don't know, the only like kind of lighter romance on this list, because I definitely do read a lot of romance, but this one is so fantastic. It means the absolute world to me. And I have here Writers and Lovers. This is a book I read for a video where I was reading like Noel Gallagher, and I just found an absolute gem. I mean, I really loved most of the books in that video, but this one just stood out to me. Again, I love books about books and especially books about writers. Now, by the title, it is about a writer. It also deals with grief, which is another thing that I really enjoy reading about. Sounds kind of morbid, but it is something that I find very interesting and I tend to read. I thought that it was such like an interesting and like real book. It's kind of more slower paced and it's not very like, I don't want to say hopeful or anything, but it doesn't like sugarcoat the real world. Have kind of like a cynical main character, maybe in some ways isn't very likable. I think that makes the story more interesting. About a 31-year-old writer just has never published anything, and all of her friends who are writers have kind of given up on that hope and on that dream. So she's kind of stuck in the middle because she is struggling to make this passion a career and to produce work that gets published, as well as the death of her mom and male love interests in her life that she's kind of torn between. You know, growing up and kind of maybe realizing that her dream isn't realistic. It's very hard, it's very complicated, but I think it's a really good book if you like about writers. And yeah, I just think it's very interesting. I really liked it. I think the only thing I didn't like about it was I didn't like who she chose in the end. Then I have here People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. It had to be on the list. I think Beach Read was on my list last year. Really like dusty as fuck. This is about Poppy and Alex. This is a best friends to lovers to enemies to... It's complicated. We follow these two best friends over the vacations that they have taken every year. They kind of had this falling out that you don't really know about until kind of later in the book, and they're going on this like vacation to kind of try to repair their relationship. And it's beautiful. I love it. Can we tell? Who doesn't love this book? I don't know. I think that the characters are so like believable and their relationship is so strong. I get to really be invested in their relationship, not only as like love interests, but as like people and as friends for the most part, because that is like who they are for most of the book. Really see the relationship change and grow. That's a really beautiful thing. I mean, it's not like a super long book by any means, but like I think that you get so much of their lives and so much of their past and really get to know them in a really great way. And I just think Emily Henry does such a great job writing characters. Genuinely, like I always fall in love with them and their faults and their quirks, and I just really love what she does. I love it so much. Yeah, I don't know. I think they had just such a great dynamic that was just so fun to read about. Next up is probably the most different book on the list, and that is Middle Game by Shawnee McGuire. Genuinely, I don't know what to say about this book because I can't really explain it in any like really great way, because it is not only like really confusing, but it's really hard to like characterize. I think I want to reread this because there is a sequel coming out, and I think it's really great not knowing exactly what this is going into it, because it is so interesting and like very complex. Not in a way that's like confusing and you won't understand, but like in a way that is really hard to pinpoint. But I'll talk about why I love it. I love it for all of those reasons. I love it because it's so complex and that the characters are so interesting. And I think this world in general is really interesting, and it poses really fascinating questions about like greater life and like what it means to be human. And these really philosophical questions, and it really makes you think, which is really interesting. And I kind of like, are you sci-fi? Like, I guess. This is my issue. But I think that if you want like a really weird and interesting book that makes you think about a lot of things in a lot of different ways, I would recommend it. Next up I have Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. It is the shiniest cover in the world. So my ring light is like having a field day. What can I say about this book? It is a great book. I love it. Wow. Okay, next. This is also about a demisexual main character. Wow, I'm just like killing it. It's about a girl named Princess who is in love basically with this like radio podcast kind of show. Makes like fan art for it and stuff like that, and she gets contacted by the person that runs it to make art for them, and she ends up finding out that the person that creates this world that she's, you know, so enamored with is actually someone who goes to her school, and so they have this really amazing friendship. Like, this is one of the best books about friendship in the entire world. It has such a great platonic relationship that, like, at the forefront of the story, like, this isn't a romance. It's so great, and I love it so much because you really see, like, how beautiful a friendship can be, because so many, like, YA books, especially, like, with, like, that are, like, straight and have, like, you know, heterosexual relationships, they're like, oh wait, girl, they're in love. No, they're in love with each other because they're best friends. Like, not for any other reason. Oh, it's just so beautiful. The way that their relationship starts and develops and becomes so strong is so beautiful, and how they are able to help one another and lean on each other through their struggles, and it's great. This is such a great book for, like, obviously it's a YA, and I think it's really great in dealing with, like, the change from high school to college. It really focuses on how difficult that is, and these characters are kind of, like, on their own for the first time, or at least one of the characters. You know, what do you do after high school? And, like, there's not necessarily a right or wrong thing to be pursuing after that, and this also deals with mental illness. We have a male-male relationship, and like I said, a demisexual main character, so it has a lot of great representation. It has some really beautiful themes and things to say. Number 5 is a book I don't own. I don't know why I don't own, like, some of these books, because I just have tried not to buy a lot of books this year. Then I have The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This is a very popular book right now. So this is about a young woman who has ultimately decided that she wants to end her life. She does that. So she ends up in this kind of, like, in-between stage called the Midnight Library, and in the Midnight Library she's able to pull out books on the shelves, see and live her life a different way. Like, if she made one different choice, like if she stayed in this one relationship, if she went after this one person, if she stayed in this job, like all the different possible realities that her life could have taken. It's basically just about regret, and obviously about depression and suicide, because that's literally what happens. I really love this book. I read this in, like, one sitting. It's such a beautiful story about life, wanting to live, and how, like, hard it is to do that. And, you know, through this journey you see her learning that, like, yeah, you can have regrets, you can have things that you've made mistakes, but like where you are is where you're meant to be, no matter what has happened. Like, all these paths were not the right ones for you, and you're on the right one. As tricky and difficult and as many heartbreak and hardships that you might go through, the one that you're on right now is ultimately the right one. Obviously, like, poetic. I know some people I think it's a little, like, convoluted in some ways. It's like, okay, she, like, blah, blah, blah. I personally think it's really beautiful. As, like, a person who deals with mental illness, I think it's really an important story, and Matt Haig has written a lot of great books with mental health representation, and I think this is a beautiful take on that. Maybe it's a little bit idealistic in some ways, but I do think it's a really hopeful book, and I think that that's really important, that it has that hopeful, meaningful message. Next up, I have a book that I read literally, like, on the last day of the month of the year, thank you, and that is Girl Made of Stars by Ashley Herring Blake. I'm so glad I read this. It is such a hard book. I've had to talk about this a lot, but especially recently because I just read it. It is a really hard book to talk about because it's so dark, I guess. I mean, the plot of this book is about a girl whose twin brother is accused of raping his girlfriend, who is her best friend. Through this experience, our main character is also kind of realizing and remembering some things about her past that she kind of had repressed, and how that relates to the whole situation. It is very hard to read. I don't think there was a part of this where I wasn't crying. Like, I think I cried from page 20 and onward. I think anyone would. It's very hard to talk about. It handles the subject matter really well. Obviously, if you cannot handle that subject matter, please don't read this book if it's at all triggering to you. I just want to make that really clear, because it is the entire plot of the book. It's not just, like, at the beginning or the end. It's the entire plot is about rape and sexual assault, it's victim blaming, and all the things that come along with that. Ooh, sometimes horrible job our society is doing at helping or hurting the victims of rape and sexual assault. So it has the message of, you know, you should be able to tell your story, no matter what that is, no matter how hard that may be or who that may impact, but because it's whatever happened to you. And it's so beautiful, it's so meaningful and impactful. I think this is a book that everyone should read if you can. Horrible things happen in this book. The messages are really important, and it's just a book that unfortunately really needed to be told. And yeah, I'll shout from the rooftops. Read this book, please. Thank you. Next up, we had to talk about it. We had to get there. Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I, like, forgot I read this book. I read this book again, like, in one sitting. It happens to the best of us. This is, like, a kind of sequel to Daisy Jones and the Six. You don't have to read one before the other. But this is such a great story. I mean, I think it's so crazy. I love not the time period necessarily that it's set. I mean, I think it's a really cool, like, historical fiction because it's set in the 80s. Blah, 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 blah. The, like, time constraints of the story are really interesting. It's kind of, like, over a day, I believe, like 24 hours. We follow all the Riva siblings, who are children of Mick Riva, who's, like, this Mick Jagger-esque character who has had these children with all these different women and has kind of just lived this rock star lifestyle and left these children to kind of fend for themselves, and now they're adults and they're having their own kind of drama and mixing up in the world of, I was gonna say Hollywood. It is kind of like a Hollywood, like, circuits and worlds, but they're in Malibu. It has, like, surfing and stuff, like some of them are surf stars or models or, like, stuff like that, like, but it is that kind of, like, fame and famous world. Anyways, it's about this one party that they throw every year, and it like gets like really out of control, and that's what happens. And it starts with like telling you how it ends, which I think is really, really fun. I think Taylor Jenkins Reid does a really good job at telling stories, especially really interesting ones. I mean, obviously this is historical fiction. Yeah, like I said, super interesting like characters. We have like a lot of, I mean, there's like 5 children, I want to say 4 or 5, and all of them are really interesting, really flawed, but also just like super interesting to read about. She does it again. Like, am I surprised? No. Number 2 is another hard book to talk about. All these books are really hard to talk about. I love hard-hitting contemporaries. I do. They're my favorites. Can we tell? So I have This Will Be Funny Someday by Katie Henry. This book has a super interesting synopsis. It's about a girl who kind of legitimately stumbles into a open mic for stand-up, does this horrible set, ends up being involved in the world of stand-up, and tells a lot of lies along the way. She's in high school, but she's making all these friends who are in college and who don't know that she's in high school, and she joins this kind of world of stand-up and kind of being able to tell her stories in a funny and comical way, which really helps her deal with all the things that are going on in her life, because her life is becoming very difficult. She has a family where she feels very left out of, has kind of lost her one close friend, and she is in this relationship that is super toxic. That's kind of why she has fallen away from the things in her life that she's really cared about. I think Katie Henry, I just think her books keep getting better. I feel like I've said this before. I've read, I think, all of her books. I just think that she has gotten better and better at reading such inventive and new stories that tackle such real things. Like, I mean, I can't really relate to being a comedian and like, I haven't really ever considered doing stand-up, but like, I think that all of the themes and topics that she covers in her books are very relatable in stories that maybe are not, or are more unconventional stories. Like, she does such a great job at like handling such a horrible topic of like abusive, toxic relationships in a way that handles the subject matter very well, but also is able to have a story that's not just about that, if that makes any sense. Because it's more about the character, and she's also like a hilarious writer. Genuinely, like, Katie Henry writes some of the funniest books, and this is no exception. I just think she does such a great job at coming up with concepts of books and making them so meaningful and also so enjoyable. The title is a tattoo I want. I think it's kind of funny, and so I was very scared to read this book going into it because I knew that I really wanted to have these words tattooed on me. This will be funny someday. Since reading this and loving it and having it mean so much to me, I totally chill with it. So I think it's a really great read. Like I said, and most of these books have some triggering content, so please be forewarned. Be cautious, you know, I don't want you to be sad. Okay, speaking of books that are sad, my number 1 book is A Heart in the Body of the World by Deb Coletti. A lot of these books are very closely related, especially like my top 5. This book, since I read it, like since the second I finished it, I was like, this is gonna be my favorite book of the year, and it hasn't changed since I read it in July. I think this is a book about our main character. I'm gonna find her name because I don't remember. Our main character, Annabelle, who is running from Seattle to DC in order to kind of help herself go through a grieving process. Yeah, to kind of process something that has happened to her. Throughout the story, you're finding more and more about that thing that happened. So it kind of works backwards in some ways, as it isn't really until kind of the end that you find out the whole story of why she feels the need to do this and why it is so important for her. But I do want to say the trigger warnings for this, but they're kind of spoilers, so I do want to just like tread with caution, but I think it's important to give trigger warning even if they might be a little spoilery. So I'm going to give trigger warnings for PTSD, sexual assault, emotional manipulation, gun violence, and death of a loved one. Again, I don't want to spoil it, but like, I think it's really important because this is a really difficult thing to read, especially the farther you get into it. It has actually like inspired me in many ways. After reading this book, I actually started running, which is really interesting. I'm not like a hashtag runner, but I do run frequently. It has become very therapeutic for me in many ways, and I'm very grateful for that because it's one of my favorite things that I discovered this past year, and it is because of this book. I think this is a super interesting story about how people deal with grief and guilt, shame, and how they all deal with it in different ways. I can't believe like it was so hard to talk about so many of those books. It was a hard year, so like I guess it makes sense that I read like really hard-hitting books and those were my favorites. But also that's generally how it works because they're like all-time favorites. They mean a lot. Those are my favorite books that I read throughout the year. I read 150 books. Those were my top 10. That was so hard to narrow down. Let me know in the comments if you guys are gonna read any of these books because I mentioned them or if you already have. That being said, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all the things, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!